Hello, and thank you for joining us. The following video is an extract from one of a series of Academic Wednesday worldwide webinars hosted by the Institute of Economic Affairs in cooperation with the Vincent Centre, University of Buckingham. In this video, we hear from Martin Agerup from the Danish Think Tank CEPOS, who discusses inequality and challenging the status quo.
Thank you very much. I've been looking forward to this. I have a presentation for you, which I'll put up. Hopefully this works. Okay, so there is a lot of debate about income inequality and non-inclusive growth. The idea that people with low income haven't been able to get a share of the growth in wealth that's been happening over the last 10-15 years or so. But what I'll be arguing in this presentation is that we are in some ways looking at this in a wrong and insufficient way, because we're looking at specific points in time and not following people over time. So I'll be showing you some data for why that's a problem. First, just a few points about, why do we do statistics about people? Well, that's to find out how people are doing, and we know from our own experience that the concept of time is central to that. The whole human experience, as literature and film and all the great art shows us, is that the human experience is about change. It's about transitioning, decisions, etc., etc. Sorry, skip. So if you go to the doctor, what the doctor tries to do is to get to know you, in a sense, in a very short period of time. So instead of just asking, how are you doing right now, the doctor will say, well, how long have you had these symptoms, or last time you had it, how did it feel? And they try to get to know people by asking, do you exercise? Do you smoke? Have you had other ailments earlier in your life, etc., etc. So, and we wouldn't argue that we would call somebody a friend or somebody a person that we knew if we hadn't known them for a period of time. So we should treat statistics in the same way. We can't just look at a specific point in time. We need to follow people over a period of time to see how they're doing. And that's part of the problem with the inequality, the way we're looking at inequality. So let's look at this statement. In recent decades, most income growth has gone to high income earners. I think a lot of people would say, well, that's what we hear, and there is some truth to that if you look at it in a specific way. But if you look at it, I would argue, in a more meaningful way, it's not the case. So this is the typical way of looking at it. You look at the growth in disposable income per income decile. So you divide everybody up into 10 income groups from low to high income. And I should tell you, this is all data for Denmark. I will be presenting a couple of things that aren't based on Danish data, and all of the calculations are done by CEPOS. So if it doesn't say anything concerning the source is CEPOS based on panel data from Statistics Denmark. So this is what you typically get for Denmark. That in fact it does look like since the period since the change of the millennium, we haven't had the income growth that we want to have for low incomes, and a lot of it has gone to high income earners. The problem with this is that you're not actually following people over time. So it's not the people who had a low income in the year 2000 that we compare to people who have a low income in the year 2018 to see, we're not following the same people over time. It's not the people who had a low income in the year 2000 that we follow until 2018 and then see how they're doing now. Instead, we're comparing people who had low income in 2000 to a different group of people who had low income in 2018. And that doesn't really tell us much about how people are actually doing, how they're getting along in terms of improving their position in life. I guess the basic question is, who is an income decile? Nobody is. I'm not a percentile. I'm not a decile. You're not. So we're people. So let's follow actual people over time. And if we do that, we get a completely different picture. Then we get a situation where the people who had a low income in the year 2000 actually had very high income growth up until the year 2018. And we have the opposite for high incomes. And you actually see a pattern that you'll see all the way through this presentation, that you get the highest income growth for low income earners and the lowest income growth for high income earners. In fact, the very top 10% usually have a decrease in income. It's not that surprising if you think about it. If you're a low income earner and you have a dynamic economy, you will probably want to earn more money, and you will be making decisions to make sure that you will earn more money. And most people are successful in doing that, and so you get this result, and that's good. On the other hand, if you're already a high income earner, you can only go one way, and we have a very competitive economy, so it's hard to stay there. Others will try and get your market share, so to speak, and you will lose some income. Now, you could say, well, how does it look if we look at a different time period? So let's try and add some time periods. This is looking at, can you see the cursor on the screen?
Yes.
Okay, so now I'm pointing at the time period from 1990 till 2018. So that's quite a long time period, and we can also add a third period, which is just the sort of recent past. And for all those time periods, it's the same pattern. You have the highest income growth for the low income earners. Obviously, the shorter the period is, the higher the income growth for low income earners, because it's easier to get a high income increase for a short period of time than for a long period of time. So that's the pattern. And part of the reason for that is that we have relatively high income mobility. So that's both out of the bottom, which is fortunate, and it's also out of the top. So out of the bottom, we have a situation where less than 50% remain in the group for the whole of the period that is shown here, from 10 to 18, and less than 30% remain in the group for all of the years. And it's the same at the top. It's about a third of the people who were top 10% in the year 2010 that remain in that group in 2018. So that's the basic story. And of course, some questions arise, and some people are very skeptical when they see these results, and they say, well, isn't that just the effect of, are you just cherry picking here? Is it just the effect of students or people who are unemployed finding jobs? So is it very specific reasons causing this, or is it, would it change if you look at different time periods? Or what if you look at money instead of percentages? So let's have a look at those. So first, this is what you get when you look at people in full-time employment in 2010, belonging to different income deciles. So people in jobs in 2010, how well did they do for the period up until 2018? And as you can see, you get the same pattern. People with low wages, low pay per hour, had the highest percentage increase. And you can see both what decile they belong to and what they earned on, I believe it's the average. It could be it could be the decile limit. Doesn't really matter. You can see how much they're earning, and you can see the percentage increase that they're getting. Same pattern, the highest increase at the bottom and the lowest increase at the top. So it's not because people move from unemployment into employment that you get this pattern. You also get it for people who are on the labor market at the beginning of this time period. it's and it's also very robust over time. So this figure shows you, if you look at people who belong to a particular income decile in the starting year, and then you look at the 5-year growth rates over the next 5 years, and you have a running average. As you can see, it is very consistent from the early 90s up until the latest year for which we have figures, which is 2018, that in every year for the next 5 years, the group that has the highest growth are the people in the first decile, so the ones with the lowest income, and it's the people at the top who have the lowest increase in income. In fact, they have a negative increase in income. So it's very, very consistent over time. The last argument, also the last quibble I tend to get with this is quibble, I think it's called. Is that correct? Is that well, that's all very well with your percentages, but what about monetary in monetary terms? And as you can see, even if you look at it in terms of money growth, this is in Danish kroner, but at least Syed, it's not euros, so you should be happy. And you get the same picture. It's the people with the lowest income at the start who have the highest income growth, even in monetary terms, not only in percentages. Now, that is very difficult for people to understand. They tend to. This is an example of what goes wrong. This is from the official statistical office in Denmark, Statistics Denmark, who came out with this tweet showing this graph, the traditional way of looking at things, where they concluded, and I need to move this to be able to read it. For the 10% with the lowest income, the income level is almost unchanged for the last 10 years, while those at the top of the income distribution have seen rising income. Now, this gives the impression that you're following the same people over time, which is not what they did when they did this. So this is misleading. Here is what a correct statement could have been. The threshold for belonging to the lowest income decile is almost unchanged for the last 10 years, while the threshold for belonging to the top decile has increased. Now, I know that statement is not as interesting and not as sexy, but it does have the advantage of being true, whereas the other statement is false. So this is relevant because it may not be a problem that the threshold for low income is stable over time if what we're looking for is in fact a labor market where you have an entry level that is actually quite low, so that people with low productivity has a chance to get a job. As long as these people are then mobile and move upwards into higher pay, which seems to be the case on average, then that's actually maybe a good thing. Some international examples. This is the famous elephant curve, and okay. First of all, the actual figures of the curve is disputed. You see a curve next to it from the economists, with other people arguing that it may not actually look that much like an elephant, the curve. But the idea of the curve is that if you look at the global income growth, you've had the highest income growth among people in the poorest percentiles, and in fact, global income inequality is decreasing. A lot of people don't know that. So you have rising income in emerging economies, China, etc. But then you have a situation where just make that bigger. And then you have a situation where you have very low income growth in this section, and that has been given a lot of attention politically. So this is seen as a cost of globalization, that people in the developed world middle class, very wealthy globally, but in comparison to other people in the developed world, middle class people haven't had that much income growth, according to the interpretation of the graph. Now, the point is that it is comparing the year 1988 to 2007. And it's not following the same people over time. So not only might it be different people in the same country that they're comparing in this graph, but it could be people in a completely different country or different continent that have moved upward and now are in a different income bracket. So the fact that you haven't had that much income growth in that percentage in that income bracket doesn't tell you much about how the middle class in the developed world has done, because you're not following the same people over time. And that's very, very important to remember. A lot of people don't remember that, including Piketty, who writes about it in his latest book. This is an example from the US, just to show you that this figure, this trend, this pattern is not only something that's occurring in Denmark. Here you see for the US income growth since 87, and you get the same pattern. You get the highest income growth both in median and average terms. The median is the blue one. Sorry about some of the language being in Danish there. The median is the blue one, and the average is the orange one, or whatever you call that color. And you see the same pattern as you just saw for the figures for Denmark. So let me just wrap this up quickly. We have to be very aware of the dynamics of income, wealth, and inequality. So this is a graph showing you that about half of the population can expect over this period of time, and maybe even a larger percentage over a lifetime, at some point in their life to be in the top 10%. So it is not irrelevant for the 90% how the 10% are doing. That's one point. Another is that it's become very popular to discuss wealth inequality over the last few years, and wealth inequality is by nature higher than income inequality, because young people tend not to have any savings. And then they tend to save money because they expect to live well into their pension years, and they want to be having a level of consumption after they've retired. And then the savings goes down as they start spending that money. So it is quite natural, if you compare somebody who's say 25 to somebody who's 65, you will observe a lot of income inequality, but if you wealth inequality. But if you follow the same person over time, you will in fact see that it is natural for there to be this kind of inequality. The same goes for inequality in income. If you look at lifetime inequality, this is again figures for Denmark, you have a much lower inequality when you take into consideration that young people tend to have a lower pay because they don't have the experience, and then as they get older, they get higher pay on the job. Not in all jobs, but in many professions, that's the situation. So to sum up, a static view of this is very short term. It's actually static. It's not, doesn't take changes into consideration, and long term dynamics are very important to understand how the economy and how life actually works. So we need to look at it from a long term perspective. Also, a static point of view tends to look at to see individuals as helpless victims of circumstance, or you by default sort of get that impression. Whereas if you look at the dynamics of it, you see people as empowered and capable to make decisions and change their position in life. And that's, I think, a very important point. And also, from a static point of view, if you look at it from a static point of view, you will probably end up with a conclusion saying that what we need to address this problem is redistribution. Whereas if you look at it from a dynamic perspective, as I've done in this presentation, you might reach the conclusion, or you're certainly more likely to reach the conclusion, that what really matters is opportunity and wealth creation. I think that was my presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Martin. I think that's raised a number of questions already in the Q&A function. So if I can ask people who have tuned in today to submit your questions using the Q&A function. But if you haven't asked a question, I'd still ask you to go to the Q&A and maybe vote on the question, so that will help me select the questions. I wonder whether I could start off with something which summarizes a few of the questions in the Q&A as well, which is, you say that your data is very much is based on Danish data, and we can understand that. But when you look at Danish income figures, it's suggested quite often that Denmark has some of the lowest levels of inequality. You think of things like the Gini coefficient, for example. So are you able to use or extend your conclusions from Denmark to other countries which are, using measures such as the Gini coefficient, have a higher level of inequality? And that also ties into some of the other questions that we've been asked, which is, if you look at the differences between our societies, you have sort of equality of opportunity in the Anglo-Saxon model and the equality of outcome, which is a more continental European perspective. And does this have an impact on income inequality? That was a question from Miko Aravil. So I wonder whether you could tackle that issue head on about Denmark being relatively less unequal or less inequality compared to other countries.
I think there's some truth to that. I'll be careful to expect exactly the same exactly the same numbers for other countries, but I would expect the same pattern. I'd expect the low income earners to have the highest income growth and the highest income earners to have the lowest income growth in all dynamic market-based economies. There are places where I wouldn't expect that, and that would be countries that don't have well-functioning market economies and a high level of competition. It is true that Denmark has a very low level of inequality. We're, I think, 4th or 5th in the OECD. But we have had rising inequality since the early 90s. It's been rising from a very low level, but it has been rising quite substantially compared to other countries. I wouldn't say it's risen substantially in a sense that it's alarming, but compared to the increase in inequality in other countries, Denmark is sort of not at the bottom. So it is interesting that a country that's seen increasing inequality has still maintained an economy where we have inclusive growth that benefits most people who are sort of part of the dynamic economy and working.
Okay, well, look, we've got about 14 questions. We'll see. We've got about just over 30 minutes. Let's see what we can get through. But I wonder if I could just make a point, and maybe you could answer it, or we can go straight to the questions, which is this. Is this not another example of what they call the fixed stock fallacy? So, people assume that it's the same people who stay in the lower incomes, just as my colleague Len Shackleton argues that when you see a growth in employment, actually what's happening is people are constantly losing their jobs and getting new jobs. There's no fixed stock. What happens when employment goes up is that more people get jobs than people who lose jobs, or the other way around when unemployment goes up. Is this just not another example of the fixed stock fallacy?
In some ways, it is. You have, so I would argue that short-term unemployment is maybe not a problem. It could be unpleasant for the people that end up being unemployed. But as long as they're unemployed on the short term, it is having a high level of churn in the economy is actually a good thing, because it shows that you have a dynamic economy where it is possible for new technology to be introduced, where globalization introduces new opportunity, etc., etc. Whereas long-term unemployment, that's a sign of a problem, and part of the problem could be structural, that you may have an inflexible labor market. It might be that there's something wrong with your how the competitive economy or the market works. It could be social problems, whatever. And I think there's a parallel. We should be aware that there is a group of people who remain in the low income group, But what we should be tackling is that problem, and not a sort of a general idea that it is somehow the top 1% of the top 10% that's the problem. What we want to address is creating a dynamic economy that is able to make sure that low-income earners get an opportunity to earn more, and more than now.
Okay, well, let's turn to the questions. We've got about 15 questions, see what we can get through. The first question is from Bruno Prior. He says, an obvious explanation for the discrepancy between cross-sectional and longitudinal studies is that people in the lowest decile are disproportionately new entrants to the job market who move up over time and are replaced by other new entrants, whereas the top deciles are closer to retirement, at which point their income falls. If so, don't the cross-sectional studies still tell us something important? New entries or new entrants, or those stuck due to ability, or new entrant level jobs are not doing as well as those who can hold on to their jobs in their 60s. Given rise in housing costs, that still leaves those in the lower paid jobs with increasing problems to establish financial stability and independence. That kind of touches on your last answer there as well, but I wonder whether you could tackle that.
Well, I didn't tackle the retirement argument, but it is true. That's another. Some people say, well, isn't the fact that the top income earners tend to have a decrease in income over time, isn't that just because they retire? But even if you take retirees out of that, you still maintain the pattern. I tell you, the basic pattern is very, very robust, very stable. You can follow a specific generation over time, so that you don't get retirees. You can follow people in employment over time, so you don't get the situation where you just get an effect of students entering the labor market, or the unemployed getting jobs. As I told you, you can take whichever approach to this you like. You'll get the same general pattern. Low income earners had the highest income growth over time. I'm not saying that's the only way to look at this, but I think it's a very, very important way to look at this question. So that doesn't mean that we don't have an economy with the challenges. I'm not an expert on Britain, but housing costs is a problem. I'm not sure the way to solve it is to interfere with the wage, the free market wage system. Probably the way to deal with it is to make housing regulation more flexible, so that more houses can be built, so demand and supply can even itself out, and you'll probably see more of an ability for people to move to areas where there are actually jobs.
Well, that kind of touches on our next question, which is from an anonymous attendee who asked the question, will levelling up regional inequality be possible in the UK? You'll be aware that the Conservative government, who won the election in December, won seats that no one ever thought they would win, and they've come to power with a promise to level up and remove regional disparities. So the question is that levelling up agenda possible in the UK?
I'm not an expert on the UK, and I think there are probably many people in the group of attendees who knows more about this than I. But generally speaking, looking at Denmark, which I know something about, and other countries, and speaking as an economist, I think something can be done. I just mentioned zoning restrictions as, I think, a very, very important issue to deal with, to make sure that the people can actually move. But it depends what you want to achieve. There's a tendency for some politicians to want to fix the problem locally, and I think that's going to be hard. There are some places that are simply more attractive for most people than others, and that tends to be the big cities. And you see that everywhere in the world, everywhere where there's development and economic growth, people move from the country towards the cities. I think it's very unlikely that we can somehow reverse that trend. I think we should sort of endorse that trend and make sure that people who want to move, want better opportunity, have the ability to do that.
Okay, next question. I'll read it for you. It's about minimum wages, and you can interpret it as you like. Is there a rise in minimum wages, or does a rise in minimum wages lead to higher income growth for low-income workers? Or do you want to talk about that relationship between minimum wage and higher?
Yeah. Well, again, I'm not an expert on this, but I've read some papers about it. There's been a development back in the 60s. Most economists were convinced that increasing minimum wages would cause more unemployment. Now, so the answer to the question is, it does increase wages for those who still remain in employment, but it also increases unemployment, and that's a problem. And it also results in entry-level jobs being at a higher wage level. So you get a risk that some people never enter the labor market and never get on the ladder of wage increase and get that mobility that I've been talking about. Then some papers over the next decades indicated that maybe the unemployment effect is not that great, and that sort of increased the argument for increasing minimum wages, at least in some countries. The latest development in terms of the research are moving back in the opposite direction. The newspapers do tend to show that unemployment does increase. They also point towards other effects. So let's say you're a low-income worker and you're working, I don't know, a fast food joint or something, and they increase the minimum wage. Well, your employer can do many things. He can say, well, from now on, you have to pay for your uniform. Or he can say, from now on, you have to pay for your parking space. So, you know, there are unintended consequences of politicians interfering in prices, including the price of labor. And I'll be very skeptical towards that.
And we've also seen in some fast food outlets that where the minimum wage has gone too high, companies have put in technology and touch screens and self-service screens. So actually reducing the overall number of jobs. Next one, Toby Miller asks, what are your thoughts on gender inequality in less economically developed countries and newly emerging economies such as India?
I have to pass on that one. I don't, I strongly disagree with it, but I don't know much about it that the general participant in the seminar doesn't know.
Okay, that's fair enough, and that's what I like about these academic webinars, where it's a free discussion, and and you're free to say where you have the knowledge and where you don't have the knowledge. It's not the conceit of knowledge that Hayek talked about. Let's move on to Robin Edwards, who's one of the trustees for the EIA. Robin, thank you for joining us. He says recent statistics released in the UK show that average incomes are back to 2007 levels, so no progress in 13 years. However, if you have assets, these have grown substantially with equity and house price rises. If you add income and wealth together, does this change your conclusions? And before you answer that, this is linked to the next question by Linda Whetstone, who's also one of our trustees, and asks the questions, are similar figures available for assets and wealth rather than just income?
Well, for Denmark, similar figures are available. And the fact is, the way, I don't know how this works in other countries, but the way disposable income is calculated in Denmark, capital income, income from capital is included as well. And also that includes your house. So if house prices go up, the disposable income of house earners goes up because of that. So for Denmark, that wouldn't change the conclusion much if we'd seen the same development in Denmark.
Can I just check? Sorry, so the data you use, does that include assets as well, or is it purely income?
Yeah, it includes income from most assets as well.
Right.
Yes.
So not just your job.
So housing, shares, etc. Capital gains would be included. Yeah.
And in terms of data, you are also able to split that out, or have you split that out in terms of earnings from wages and earnings from assets?
that can be split up, and we can even look at the contribution to the Gini coefficient from the different types of income. So there's been a substantial contribution to the Gini coefficient from capital gains income.
Right. So answering Robin Edwards' question, where he says, if you add income and wealth together, this has changed the conclusions. You're saying you are already including both income and wealth, are you?
Well, the income from wealth, yes,
Right.
but you can't add income and wealth because it's a bit like your question about the stock and the change. So,
right.
So you can't add those, but you can add the income from wealth, and we have that in our figures for Denmark.
Well, thank you, and thank you to Linda and Robin for their questions. Next question from Dimitrios Syrakos. He says, could I please ask, what is the sample used? As individuals get older, it is likely their disposable income increases. Are there not intergenerational considerations? Thanks a lot.
Well, it's not a sample. It's the full population of Denmark. We have a very big brother. Denmark was watching us, but there are strict rules on you can only use the data in an anonymized form. So it is not a sample; it's the full population in principle. There are always tricky questions of how do you deal with people who suddenly die during your the period you're looking at, etc. But it's the full population. Sorry, was that the question? Was it a technical question, or was there something?
Let me just just check. I dismissed the question. Sorry about that. Let me just double check the question. Yes, are there not intergenerational considerations?
You would have exactly the same pattern if you just follow a specific generation or even a specific birth year. I had a figure for everybody born in 1967. I didn't use it in the presentation because I had to, cut it down a little bit. But it shows exactly the same pattern.
Well, I have to say, 1967 is a great year to be born. No personal bias there.
Well, I was born in '66, Syed, so I disagree with you strongly.
Fair enough. Well, it's good that we have a debate on our relative ages. Right, let's move on to the next question. Claire Talbot, probably a variation of a similar question. This is very interesting. Thank you, Martin. Has similar analysis been done for other countries?
I showed you one from the US. I'm aware of that, and the actual sources on the slide that I presented there. So if you want to share the presentation, you can get the source there. Otherwise, you can contact me and I can send you a link to that paper.
Okay, great. And what I'll do is
there are probably others, but that's the one I'm aware of.
So if you get a chance, Martin, I'll ask you to put the best email address into the chat function if anyone wants to contact you.
Sure.
Okay, can I also ask viewers to keep on voting? Let's see if we can squeeze in the 12 questions in the 20 minutes available. David Middleton, former chairman of our trustees. David, thank you very much for joining us. It says, very interesting, but I was surprised you said nothing about the major reduction in worldwide absolute poverty in recent years.
I could have said something about that, but that wasn't the topic of my presentation. I was talking about the dynamics of income mobility and how you should look at why you should look at following people over time. But it's absolutely true that if you look at it globally, within countries, in some countries, in most countries, inequality has risen in recent years, or rather in recent decades. In recent years, it might have gone down. We don't know that. But if you look at it globally, if you take the whole human population of the world, the data that's available suggests that we've seen quite a significant decrease in income inequality globally. And you've certainly, we're sure of that, seen an enormous decrease in global poverty, both in terms of numbers and in the share of the global population. That's great news.
Okay, we're going to go on to the next questions. I'm going to apologize to Miko and Demetrius because I've already asked their previous questions, and I'll come back to your second question if we have a chance. But I'd like to give other people a chance to come in. Next one is, do you think that it matters? And if it does, in what way, if the very top 1% of income accrues from a bureaucratic process of corporate remuneration committees, as might be in the UK and USA, than if that income derives from the ownership of productive capital, perhaps might have been the case in Germany?
Well, let me just take it up one level before I move it down to the specifics of this level. I think it's very important when we discuss top incomes, whether it's top 1% or top 0.1% or whatever, that we're aware of the fact, what I consider to be a fact, I guess it's an opinion, that there's no problem with people earning very high incomes as long as they're earned in a way that benefits the whole of society, in a free market economy where you have competition. So Steve Jobs created several products that simply did not exist before. Well, he didn't do it alone, but he was certainly instrumental in getting it done. And because of that, he became a billionaire. Now, that he hasn't taken anything from anyone. He's increased the pie, and he's done well. Compare that to Carlos Slim of Mexico, who got a sweet deal with his political cronies and took over a telecommunications company that where he maintained a monopoly, charged exorbitant prices for telephone services, so that poor Mexicans had to pay that, and that's why he became one of the richest men in the world. Now that is extortion. That's crony capitalism. That's bad. I think generally speaking, we in a free society, we need to trust institutions, including private business, to make fair and good decisions. The boards of private businesses have no reason to pay their CEO too high a salary. They want to get the right level. Now, sometimes they make a mistake, and they do that at every level. Sometimes companies hire staff that turn out not to be worth what they're paying them, and then they have to let them go. And that's true for CEOs as well. But generally speaking, a company will do well if they manage to pay people the right pay, and that goes for CEOs as well. So I think we need to trust the system, the free market system, and accept that there might be very good reasons why CEOs get very high pay.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. As I said, apologies to if you've already asked a question. I'm going to try and share it around. Next question, Tom Packer. How much do you think cultural capacity drives increases and decreases in inequality, separate from the actions of government?
So that's individuals' cultural capacity.
Well, it could be. I mean, it could be individuals. I mean, some disagree. I suppose culture is values are individual. Cultural is a collective. Others would say, for example, there are some cultures where entrepreneurship thrives far more than other cultures. So I suppose Tom's asking about that culture. How does that drive, or how is that a factor in inequality?
I think it's probably important that there has been some work done on that. So if you look at this is more on the individual level. If you look at intergenerational mobility, you would want a society where people with skills, with different with a certain level of skills, get a level playing field, and therefore achieve at the level they want to achieve, whether they come from one type of family or another. That shouldn't play into it. The fact of the matter is it does, and to some extent that might be because that's probably because there are some types of families that our educational system is not as good at helping as others, and that's a huge problem. That's something we need to be very aware of. But there's also something else that might be a problem, might not be a problem. Is that some families have a family culture or a tradition that is more aspiring, more based on sort of a drive towards achievement. And you might have other families that don't instill that in their children. Now, is that a good or a bad thing? I think we should accept that at least to the extent that you don't end up ruining your life, it is fine to settle for a life that is not based on the idea that you'll do great things, but you in other ways will have a great life and not worry too much about that. So that's individual decisions, and to the extent it's your parents instilling that ambition, it's a very tricky discussion. But I would tend to be very careful not to intervene in what's going on in the families.
Okay, the next question from Julian Mutz or Mutz. I apologize if I've mispronounced it. Do these numbers that you've shown take into account the absolute growth in income? He says that he would imagine that individuals in the lowest income decile at baseline might have the largest growth in percentage terms, but the absolute growth is probably tiny compared to the absolute growth in the higher income groups.
Well, I did actually show you a figure showing that even in terms of monetary growth, you have the highest growth in the low income brackets.
Okay. David McKinley asks, is it fair to say opportunity is critically dependent on skills, which we can upgrade throughout our life? In truth, the workforce has two main bands, unskilled stroke manual and possessing technical professional skills. By upgrading skills, we can move up, so education is the key objective to improve one's development.
Well, education, when we talk about education, a lot of people tend to focus very, in my opinion, very narrowly on formal education. I'm somewhat skeptical towards that. Obviously, if you're an airline pilot, you do need a formal education how to fly this specific plane that you're flying. And I would want a pilot to have had training in flying that specific plane before I enter it. In fact, I'm looking forward to flying. I wouldn't have believed that a few months ago, but I am looking forward to that happening again sometime. But generally speaking, what we're interested in is human capital, and formal education and human capital are two different things. So it is much more tricky than we tend to think to control this process and to sort of often you get politicians and people debating these issues of inequality saying, well, we just need to educate people. Yes, but we are educating people and we are spending a lot of money on education, and we have been trying to solve to the extent it is a problem, the problem of inequality through education for decades. And it's a very, very hard thing to do because it's not about formal education, it's about human capital. So what you put in is not necessarily what comes out at the end. And that goes back to the former questions about culture and norms and values of individuals. So okay. I hope that's an answer.
So the next question that they ask is sort of two parts, but we'll let them get away with it because they're anonymous, so we can't find out who they are. They ask a question. First of all, they ask, do you think inherited wealth factors hugely into income inequality? So hold that thought for a moment about inherited wealth. And secondly, you stated that young people do not save, which leads to high levels of wealth inequality. But isn't this argument flawed because it's not applicable to all young people? And if your statement is correct, do you have a statistic high enough to prove that your statement is correct, that young people do not save?
Well, to take the last question first, I must have expressed myself poorly. My point was not that young people don't save. My point was, the point that I wanted to put across was that young people haven't had that much time yet to save. At some point in their life, most people start saving money At least in Denmark they do, and I think they probably do in Britain as well. Since saving is an accumulation over time, the younger you are, the less likely you are to have much savings. Of course, that is not true if you have inherited. What tends to be the case nowadays is that inheritance is something that you cannot expect until you are close to being a pensioner yourself. So unless we're talking about very large fortunes, I would argue that it doesn't really play that much of a role for most people. Yeah, I guess I could go on about inheritance and wealth, but yeah.
You don't suddenly get lots of teenagers, for example, inherited wealth. You do get some, but it tends to be people older.
It does happen, but it's very rare. If you look at the data for Denmark, most of the people who inherit are pensioners themselves, or close to being pensioners,
or people who've just lost their parents.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Next question from Richard Parsonson. He said,
Can I say one more thing about wealth?
Yeah, please do. Yes, please do. Yeah.
We over the last few years, we've had data for Denmark on wealth that includes pension wealth. And those data shows that wealth inequality in Denmark is decreasing and has been for some years. And it's likely that wealth inequality in Denmark has been decreasing since the 1990s. Now, the main reason for that is actually a privatization. If you think of it, if you have a very expanded welfare state where people get their pension from the state, very few people in the middle class and working class will save much money, because they'll think, well, I get my pension from the state. So if you compare wealth, most people will have none, and then a few people will have a lot, and you'll have a lot of wealth inequality. When you get rid of state pensions and people start saving for their own pension systems, wealth inequality decreases, and that's what's happening in Denmark.
Okay. Next question from Richard Parsonson. He says, you have a presentation where you challenge the way that we think about equality or inequality, and he says, well, that's all very well, but it doesn't stop the left making the argument that you're challenging. How could it best be countered and the truth and reality explained to the public? How do we get your message across in a better way to the public?
Well, you take what I've said and you take my figures, and then you find someone who's better at putting it forward in a more sort of popular way than I am, and off you go.
And if there are any good PR people out there who can advise Martin or advise Richard on how to get that data out across and run webinars like this, please let me know. Next question from Linda Webster. She said, in your presentation, you did mention about there has been, actually, I think it's probably an answer to my question, actually, that there has been rising inequality in Denmark. Doesn't that go against your findings?
No, it doesn't. That's because the level of income inequality is measured at a given point in time. So that is exactly the static way of looking at things that gives you a different result from when you look at it from a dynamic perspective. So that's the answer to that question. So you can have a situation where the entry level job remains at the same wage level, and the sort of top, the high income earners have increase in income. So there'll be a greater gap, and that could measure out as higher income inequality at any given moment. But as long as everybody has an increase in their income when they enter the labor market, you'll have an inclusive growth situation.
All right, so it's about 3 minutes to 2 over here. We've got probably time for one more question. That's from Jonathan Madison. He said, would you happen to have specific prescriptions for Latin America, a region with inequality reinforced by historical institutions and a consolidation of land ownership?
No, I'm sorry. I'm not an expert. I've read Hernando de Soto's brilliant book, The Mystery of Capital, and I think everybody should read that. But I'm not going to move any further. Free markets, economic freedom tends to help.
Property rights, liberalisation. Okay, last. I tell you what, I will squeeze one more in then. Should there be a system in place to ensure and encourage savings through a person's life until they reach pension age, rather than people having to rely on low state pensions?
That's a typical sort of classical liberal dilemma in a welfare state, because I'm not in favor of forcing people to save, or even to create sort of special incentives for people to save. But if you have a situation where you can either save and then spend your own money, or you can not save and spend somebody else's money when you become a pensioner, you have a dilemma. And in that case, it might be better to tell people that they have to save up their own money so that they don't end up spending other people's money when they retire. Because in modern Western welfare states, we don't seem to be willing, and I find that understandable, to accept that people sort of, if they reach retirement and they haven't made savings, we're not willing to accept that people will have to face the consequences of that. So old people living in poverty is something that we find hard to accept, even if they could have saved all their lives. And that does create a sort of second best solution that could be forcing people to save.
Well, Martin,
I don't like it.
Yeah, of course, it's one. Well, there are a number of classical liberal dilemmas, and I'm sure you and I will write about them for many years. Well, thank you for watching. That was a challenging talk from Martin, which encouraged us to change the way that we look at some of the statistics around inequality. And he encouraged us to take account of the dynamic changes in people's income. For more details of our content online, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel, IA London, or listen to our podcasts at Podbean, or visit our website, ia.org.uk. To help us keep providing free content during these tough times, please do consider making a contribution, no matter how modest, by donating online at ia.org.uk. Thank you for watching or listening today.